What you are about to analyze is not a political controversy, it is a constitutional stress test. For the first time in this presidency, a meaningful check is being applied not by the opposing party, but from within the governing coalition itself. Republican members of Congress are engaging in a quiet procedural revolt, not over ideology, but over the consolidation and application of unilateral executive power. This shift represents a critical inflection point, moving the conflict from the political arena into the realm of institutional safeguards. The catalyst is a confluence of actions by the executive branch. The floated possibility of unilateral military action against allied territory, the declaration of a national emergency for economic objectives, and a pattern of evading congressional oversight through delayed disclosures and contested legal interpretations. Each, on its own, might be dismissed as political posturing. Together, they form a pattern that has triggered a procedural immune response from the legislative branch. Let's examine the legal mechanics at the core of this rupture. First, the war powers challenge. The administration's rhetorical exploration of military options against Greenland, a territory of NATO ally Denmark, forced a constitutional confrontation. The War Powers Resolution exists precisely to prevent the executive from unilaterally committing the nation to armed conflict. When such rhetoric moves from speculative to operational, Congress has a duty to reassert its constitutional authority to declare war. The bipartisan advancement of a resolution to limit such action is not a policy disagreement. It is a recalibration of institutional balance. The furious reaction from the White House, personal threats against lawmakers, confirms this is viewed not as a policy debate, but as a challenge to perceived inherent authority. Second, the emergency power precedent. The declaration of a national emergency regarding Venezuelan oil assets is being leveraged for a secondary purpose: to create a legal shield against congressional oversight and to reframe economic policy as national security imperatives. This tactic tests the limits of the National Emergencies Act, which allows Congress to terminate an emergency declaration by a concurrent resolution. The Republican willingness to consider this tool signals a fear that emergency powers are being normalized as a routine governance tactic, eroding the legislative branch's role in checking executive overreach. The oversight and accountability impasse highlights a critical issue in our governance. Systematic delays and obfuscation in responding to congressional oversight requests create a procedural crisis. This undermines Congress's fundamental power of inquiry, as established in McGrain v. Daugherty in 1927. When subpoenas are ignored and deadlines are optional, the checks and balances of our system falter. Lawmakers seeking Inspector General reviews and compliance are not making accusations. They are enforcing necessary processes. This procedural standoff poses a greater threat to presidential authority than any political attack, as it operates within a neutral legal framework that cannot be easily dismissed as partisan. The Republican response is a form of institutional triage, driven by a long-term calculus that includes several key factors: precedent risk, where every unilateral action sets a legal precedent for future administrations; alliance integrity, where threats against NATO territory jeopardize decades of American security policy; political liability, where unpopular military or economic actions threaten electoral prospects; and constitutional duty, a recognition of the oath to support and defend the Constitution among co-equal branches. This is not an ideological revolt. It is a sovereign risk assessment by the party in power. We can expect an escalation of institutional conflict through legal and procedural channels, including increased use of the Congressional Review Act to overturn executive actions, strategic amendments to legislation to restrict funding for contested initiatives, heightened scrutiny of judicial nominations regarding executive power, and more frequent subpoena enforcement litigation. The outcome of this stress test will depend on whether the guardrails of process, statutes, oversight mechanisms, and constitutional norms prove stronger than the pressure of unitary action. History shows that when a political party prioritizes the preservation of the system over protecting a leader, a critical threshold is crossed. We are witnessing the early steps across that threshold, with future moves measured not in tweets or speeches, but in legislative actions, court filings, and the persistent enforcement of congressional procedure. The system is not breaking. It is being forced to prove it still works.
Question 1. Which organ can regrow itself after damage? Answer: liver. Question 2. Which disease once wiped out 1/3 of Europe's population? Follow me. Answer: bubonic plague. Question 3. Which part of the body has no blood supply and heals very slowly? Answer: cartilage. Question 4. What is the largest cell in the human body? Answer: egg cell. Question 5. Which disease is called the silent killer because it shows no symptoms early? Drop the answer in comment section. Question 6. Which organ works even when you are brain dead? Answer: heart.